Welcome everyone to our second fall One Health seminar series. This series is organized by the University of Guelph One Health Institute and all the grad students enrolled in the One Health Collaborative specialization. My name is Carrie McMullen, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Population Medicine, and I'm also one of the One Health students. I'll be facilitating the opening for today's seminar. With great respect, we want to acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. As I reflect on my own learnings and my own path from our first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I really wanted to share a piece that I resonated with. And that's the fact that reconciliation is not a destination. It's a journey that we all need to travel along so we can continue to learn and grow and move forward in the spirit of peace and collaboration. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to inform you that we are recording this seminar, and it will be posted to the One Health YouTube channel, and a link will be made on the One Health Institute website. The recording may also be used by the One Health Institute for promoting and showcasing One Health work being done on our campus. And if you have any questions or concerns about the recording, or if you have questions about One Health in general, you can contact us at our email, and I will throw that into the chat in a second. At the end of the seminar, there will be time for questions and discussion. So you can ask your questions by using the raise your hand function in Zoom, and the facilitator can call on you to ask your question orally, or you can type your question into the chat. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Carrie Dunfield is a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph and holds a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Microbiology of Agroecosystems. Her research focuses on the impacts of human activities on soil health and ecosystem functions. And this is accomplished through collaborations with research groups across campus. So today she's here to discuss with us the role of soil health in One Health. So go ahead, Dr. Dunfield.
Great, thank you. I'll attempt to share. All right, is that, I can't see you anymore, but someone tell me that's not good. All right, thanks everybody for having me.
We don't see your slides yet.
Oh, you
sorry.
don't see it?
No.
Okay. Okay, just a second, I gotta go back. Okay, so now do you see, let's see if I can do it. There?
Yeah,
that's okay. Perfect. Okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, you'd think I'd have this figured out. I even did a practice, so apparently it's not possible for me. But thank you for the introduction. It's actually been interesting. I've been thinking a bit about One Health over the years. I'm a microbiologist originally, and but the connection from soil health to One Health is not really direct, or I'm going to try to convince you that it's more direct than we think sometimes. And so I know it's kind of outside of the realm of what we often think about as One Health, but it's been a few years and I've been trying to think about like how we can incorporate it a bit more and think about it more. So maybe I'll convince you a little bit. So I was talking a lot about soils and soil health when I was putting these slides together, and I thought maybe I'd just throw in a couple slides at the beginning to talk about me a little bit. And so I'm originally a microbiologist from the University of Calgary, and I did an undergrad just in straight microbiology, like kind of a medical microbiology. And I really was not thrilled about kind of the medical microbiology field when I came out, but I got introduced to agricultural systems just at the very end of my undergrad, and I ended up working for an agriculture company. And so my master's is in plant science and my PhD is in soil science. And I kind of didn't know what I was going to do, but at the end, it all kind of came together. And so I'm kind of interdisciplinary, and you'll probably see that in my research. But basically, all of our work is really field-based. And so students are out in the field sampling soil or water or whatever media we're working in. And then we come back to the lab and we use genomics tools for assessment. And so now probably at least a quarter, and I think probably a half of their lives are spent behind a computer looking at bioinformatics, but it's kind of the general process. And so it's really a combination of both field and lab work. But microbiology is kind of at the heart of it. And the reason I really got excited about soil microbiology is just because of the huge diversity of microbes in the soil. So we know that there's more organisms in a tablespoon of healthy soil than there are people on the planet. And what that means is that soil hosts a quarter of the planet's biodiversity. So because of this diversity, there's so much going on in soil and so many organisms that are doing so many different things. And that makes them kind of really exciting and challenging to study and work with, but makes them really important in the entire ecosystem. And so my interest is less on who the organisms are and more on what they're doing. So I'm really interested in what the microorganisms are doing in the system. And so when we talk about soil health, we often think about soil ecosystem services. And those are the services that soils are providing to kind of humans on the planet. So what are soils doing in the world? What do we need them to do? And microbes, in my opinion, microbes are really driving all of these things. So they're actually what's holding together soil structure. So bacterial biofilms and fungal hyphae are actually binding together the soil particles that make that soil structure. And that's what prevents compaction and allows water to flow through soils. They're responsible for carbon sequestration and any kind of organic matter turnover in the soils. They're doing all of the nutrient transformations, so soil biogeochemical cycles, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, any kind of micronutrient cycling is done by microbes in the soils. And they're also directly affecting plant production. So they can be plant pathogens, but they can also be plant growth promoters. And so they have that direct effect. And so when we think about soil health, this is really kind of the things that we are asking soils to do. And so my work is not only in agriculture, but we do a lot of work thinking about agriculture. And one of the reasons is because of this challenge that we're asking farmers to feed the 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. And we know that agriculture comes with some environmental consequences. So greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient losses, carbon losses, sometimes in these systems. So some of the work I've been doing over the years is really collaborations with food from thought researchers. And prior to that, really thinking about how we can produce food while protecting the environment. So minimizing any kind of environmental impact, but also maximizing productivity. And that's the goal. And that's what from an agricultural perspective, we always we don't want to lose that productivity. And so that's where I think the focus needs to be on soil, because soils produce 95% of the global food supply. So protecting these soils is really important for food security. And so we have some really cool research trials at the University of Guelph. We're lucky to have a long-term collaboration with OMAFRA. And so we have some of the longest agricultural research trials in North America. And so we've learned a lot from these systems. This is a trial at the Laura Research Station that looks at crop rotation and tillage. It was led for a long time by Bill Dean, who's just recently retired from plant agriculture, but he has some interesting findings that shows that crop rotations that have a healthy soil system are more resilient, meaning that the crop yields are protected in years where there's drought. They actually have an increased yield in drought years. And so under climate change conditions, you actually have protection of your crop yields. And so for this talk, I was thinking, how does that relate to One Health? And I think that the idea is that you have consistent food production, even in climate change. You're getting in these healthy soils, you're getting consistent foods, even in droughty years or in wet years, your yields are stable, which is really important. The second thing we find in healthy soils is that soils that are impaired from soil health often take a lot more input. So they either need more water to get equal yields or more nutrients or pesticides, or even if soil's compacted, for example, they need more energy for tillage. And so those nutrient inputs are a key kind of indicator that your soils are not healthy, because you still need to keep your yields consistent. And so what we see in the trials at Allura is that under these soil health or sustainable management practices, you require less fertilizer to get equal yields. And so, so this idea of fewer inputs, fewer chemicals, fewer fertilizers and pesticides on your foods and your crops is kind of this kind of idea that we're looking at. And so the next thing we've been thinking a lot about is not just that agriculture needs to produce food, but we're now asking agriculture to save the climate. So there's a lot of, obviously we've been thinking a lot about CO2 emissions and increases in CO2, and we know that soils are capable of sequestering carbon. And so what there's been a lot of talk about is having agricultural systems that produce food while actually improving the environment and also still maintaining that productivity. And so that's kind of where agriculture is going, looking to try to sequester carbon. And so healthy soils can sequester carbon. We know that healthy soils improve soil quality. So you can increase organic carbon and total nitrogen in our systems in Allura and Ridgetown that have a healthy rotation. And we also know that agricultural soils, like I said at the beginning, can be emitters of greenhouse gases. So there can be a major source of nitrous oxide emissions. And some of the work that we've done with ag meteorologist Claudia Wagner-Riddle in our department, who's looked at nitrous oxide emissions in these systems, has shown that certain soil management practices like retaining crop residues or shifting to zero tillage or using like a nitrification inhibitor can reduce nitrous oxide emissions. So these kind of soil practices can help decrease those greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural systems. So for the One Health link, I was thinking if it would just save the planet, then that seems to fit into the One Health to me. So yeah, we're looking at all of these things that we're trying to do with soils. So the next link and the value of soil health that we think about mostly in my lab is soil biodiversity and healthy soils that we've seen in Allura that the management practices that we've been talking about do have a unique soil microbiome. And there's been a lot of direct links over the years between soil biodiversity and soil health and human health. And some of the original, one of the original papers back in 2015 that kind of set up this link was by Diana Wall, and she's a soil ecologist from Colorado State. And she produced this kind of perspective piece where she proposed that shifting from an intensive agricultural system to a sustainable agricultural system can have direct effects on human health by increasing soil biodiversity under the sustainable system, which increases beneficial organisms and decreases pests and pathogens. And so that can directly lead to plant and animal health impacts, and then through those cascade up to human impacts. And so this is kind of an original perspective on this linkage. And so a lot of my work has really focused on, this paper really focused on kind of the shift between intensive and sustainable by changing completely from an intensive agricultural system to like an organic system. And so my interest has really been within still an intensive agricultural system like we see a lot in Ontario, not an organic system. Are there sustainable management practices that we can use that lead to the same types of increases in soil biodiversity and the same beneficial impacts? And so that's where we've been focusing a lot of our work. I just wanted to also mention recently, there's in 2021, there's been some more direct links made between the soil microbiome and soil health and human health through this microbiome pathway. So this report, the Regenerative Agriculture and Human Health Nexus, that was recently released, makes the case that there's kind of some, there's impacts through food nutrition, specifically through changes to food nutrient density, but there's also possibly links straight from the soil microbiome to the gut microbiome of organisms. And so that type of research isn't clearly understood, but we know that the gut microbiome has impacts on human health, and that's been shown in a number of studies. And so this link between do soil microbes on your food or that enter the system have impacts on your gut microbiome kind of more directly that we don't usually think about is kind of interesting, and probably one of the next areas of research that people will get into a bit more. So our personal research has thought about this a little bit, our personal research group, less about the direct links between soil microbes and human gut microbes, but more kind of in this indirect, where we see this link between the microbiome and the plant and the soil environment. And this kind of three-way interaction is really what drives plants and plant growth and plant health and nutrition. And so it's really the combination of the three things that are really making plants grow and driving yields and plant health. And we also have a paper more recently looking at the direct microbial mediated nutrient transformation. So how plants actually get nutrients from the soil system. And there's many pathways that microbes leads to nutrient uptake in plants. And so if you think about any system that changes the microbes that are present in the soil, might then be impacting these plant pathways and how they're getting this nutrition. And so there's these kinds of cascading impacts that we think about. So I feel like I'm hopefully have talked you into thinking that soil health is important. And I thought it might be important to kind of just stop there and let you know that soils across the globe are really in crisis. And so while we know that soil health is really key in all these ecosystem services and can help with food production and climate change, we also, on the flip side, need to remember that soils are really at risk across the globe, either due to pollution or due to urbanization. So land loss for a number of reasons. And also specifically in Ontario soils are losing organic matter. So greater than 82% of Ontario soils are losing organic matter, and 57% are classified as in moderate to very high risk of erosion. So we're actually physically losing these soils. And so this is where we know soils are important and they have a huge role, but we're also, we're losing them. And so we need to kind of put a stop to this. And this is where we're trying to come up with solutions on how to protect soils. And so we can build soil health through sustainable agricultural practices. And in more recently, people have been thinking about regenerative agriculture. There's been a lot of industrial support for regenerative agricultural practices, which involves several types of ways that we can, where soil health is really is kind of a pillar in regenerative agriculture. But there's several principles within regenerative agriculture that has to do with soils. And so in practice, we can think about best management practices that kind of support these principles. Something like, so things like reducing tillage. So using a conservation or no tillage approach to reduce tillage and protect from erosion. Increasing biodiversity in your system, either through crop rotation or adding a perennialized rotation into your system so that you have higher above ground diversity. There's also, you want to keep as much of the soil covered as long as you can in the system. So retaining crop residues, also things like conservation buffers that border waterways can help protect soils from erosion loss. Cover crops have been suggested as a big component in agricultural systems to keep kind of living roots on the ground and make sure there's never bare soil present. And then kind of most recently with this regenerative agriculture movement has been thinking about incorporating or integrating livestock into these systems. So either using organic amendments or manures onto the soils, or actually even using livestock grazing, where you have rotational grazing or grazing of cover crops. So you actually have the animals in the land. And so this is kind of one of the things that where my research started when I came to Guelph, was back to this idea of integrating livestock. And this is kind of more of a direct impact on human health, and kind of where we traditionally think about how maybe soils and the One Health axes kind of overlap. So this was a little cartoon of me when I had just been here for a few years, and it was one of my first research projects looking at the different applications of manures onto soils and following E. coli as it was released from manure into the soil system. And so we were able to show that different types of surface application of manures had different kind of impacts on water quality by E. coli, which is of course a pathogen, human pathogen. And we also kind of took that a little further and followed the pathogens through the soil system and into groundwater, and showed that after manure was applied, you could have impacts on groundwater, especially in areas around Guelph where you have a really fractured bedrock system, and you can have a lot of fractures and a lot of movement into groundwater. And so these are really kind of direct impacts on human health. We're actually kind of following this up with a more recent study, and I'm collaborating with some members of OVC and plant agriculture, and thinking about rotational grazing and One Health. And we're looking at the Laura Research Station, where they have some rotational grazing or pasture management studies, and also some collaborating with some farmers who have these farms in place. And the farmers, and one of the things that the beef industry are really interested in is how does rotational grazing impact soil carbon and soil health. So the soil scientists are really kind of interested from that perspective. But there's also really important questions around how do these systems impact pathogens in the environment and antimicrobial resistant bacteria in the environment. And so working with Heather and Nicole, we're kind of getting at all of these questions. And so it's really kind of an exciting new project, looking at kind of from a full One Health perspective. And my role is somewhat around soil health, but generally what I'm mostly interested in is kind of this indirect impact on soil health. So the impact on soil biodiversity. So either through integrating livestock or any of those sustainable practices, or shifting from a simple to diverse rotation, how does that, we know that has impacts on the soil microbial community. We look at usually the bacterial and fungal communities and their diversity. And we see that more diverse plant covers or may impact carbon and nutrient inputs, and that can change the microbial community, which then can have a change in the plant nutrition and food quality, and then also changes these other functions that we talked about at the beginning, like plant health, nutrient cycling, and carbon sequestration. And so that's where a lot of our work is really focused, and we try to think about those communities and what's happening when you put these sustainable management practices in place. And I just thought I would just highlight that most of our work is really focused on bacteria and fungi, but the soil food web is really diverse, where at the bottom of the food web are these plants and agricultural systems that are driving the first trophic level, which tends to be the bacteria and fungi. But they also have very complicated, sorry, snoring. It's a very complicated food web. So there's higher cascading trophic effects. If you change your bacterial and fungal communities, you'll have cascading effects throughout your food web, and that can change a lot of different soil processes. So just kind of one example, I didn't think I would go too far into a lot of this research, but one example of some of the work we've been working on is a long-term cover crop experiment at the Ridgetown Research Station, and our collaborator is Laura Van Erd, and she's done tons of work on this trial that looked at 4 different cover crop varieties. And I had a master's student and a postdoc that have been working on this most recently. What Laura found is that the different cover crops have different biomass, where there's different amounts of plants that are in her system. And she also sees that when she follows marketable tomato yields, so the year after the cover crops are grown, there is actually a benefit of some of the cover crops on tomato yields. So under radish and rye radish, she gets an increased yield compared to no cover crops. And when she looked at the nitrogen cycling in the system and the biomass carbon nitrogen ratios in the actual cover crops, there wasn't any real direct link that could explain this benefit of the cover crops to the tomatoes. And so that's where we thought maybe the microbes are playing a role in this system. And so we actually, so this is just kind of an example of some of the work we do. So we went into the cover crops, so we sampled soils, and we did sequencing, Illumina sequencing, to look at fungal communities. And so this is just a very microbial graph where you have like a taxa bar plot to kind of show differences across the communities. And if you look at the residues, there's certain organisms that can be related statistically to presence of different cover crops. And what we see is that some organisms tend to be higher under some cover crops. This one was, for example, a plant pathogen. We also had a residue impact, and what we saw was when residue was present, we got increased mycorrhizal fungi, which are known to be beneficial to plants. And we did the same with bacteria. And what we find, which is what we often find in these studies, is that there's some important organisms there that are gene sequences that we really don't know what they do. And so they're uncultured. And so 99% of the soil organisms are actually not culturable. So we still are asking questions about what they do in these systems. In this case, we actually just correlated plant biomass with some of these different organisms, and we saw that uncultured bacteria actually was significantly correlated with lower plant biomass, so suggesting possibly it's a different pathogen. And other organisms we see are actually correlated with higher plant biomass, suggesting they have different functions. So it's really important to know that you're making all these shifts in soil biodiversity, and each of those shifts really carries a consequence to the function of the system. And so really it's just the kind of the summary I wanted to make is it's really a complicated question. We know that some practices can have direct impacts on plant health and plant yields and soil quality, and they will also have an impact on soil microorganisms. But if you really start digging into some of them, it gets really complicated. This is one of the studies we did on our long-term trial, where we know corn, soy, wheat with red clover is a healthier system than corn, soybean, that we usually see higher yield benefits and better carbon, but we also found actually increased nitrogen cycling and increased organisms that were responsible for nitrous oxide emissions and actually increased greenhouse gases in the system after nitrogen fertilization. And so it's really kind of a balance. If you're impacting any kind of soil biodiversity, you're also impacting these functions. And so we have to get really a handle on what the management practices are doing. So just thinking a little bit about policy, just in 2021, there's been a call for including soil biodiversity variables in agriculture, forestry, climate, and nature conservation policy as a way to be an indicator of soil health and some of these important ecosystem services. And so people are really starting to pay attention to soil biodiversity and its role. And maybe just a final thought of how this soil health and One Health links. Roberta Bondar was here a few years ago now, but we haven't had any in-person conferences for a while. And she, of course, is the first female astronaut, and she did her undergrad at Guelph. And one of the quotes I took away from that talk was, she said, if we don't have a great soil on the planet, we won't exist at all. So thinking about all these important roles that soil play really does have an impact on all of these important things that we're looking for from the world. So we were pretty proud that she had taken a soils course from the University of Guelph. So that was cool for us. So we have a couple of really interesting programs that I'm involved in. If you want to learn more about soils, we have Soils at Guelph, which is, if you go to that website, it's a program that we've established a few years ago with a donation that basically our goal is really to inform the public about the importance of soils and what a role they play, and try to just really network with people that are interested in soils. And also we have create a graduate training program called Climate Smart Soils, where we're training graduates, and we're really looking for interdisciplinary graduates that are just interested in being able to kind of communicate about climate change and communicate about the importance of kind of soils in climate change. And so this is, we're in our third year now, and it's been a pretty successful program in training students. And I have a very old picture of my lab here because we haven't had very many group pictures, but some of them are still around. Yeah, I just thought I'll just leave it at that, I think. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to try to tackle them.